So we're in this series called Like a Good Neighbor, and it kind of comes on a journey that we've been on for the last couple months, really, of trying to find out what our mission is. As a group of people and as individuals, trying to identify our mission. And in this particular series, we're trying to figure out what does God want you as an individual human being to be doing in the individual locations where you live. Not necessarily this big umbrella kind of deal, but just for you personally, as an individual. And so as part of the process, we've been studying this book, some of us in our life groups. It's called Discover Your Mission Now. This is a QR code. You scan it with your phone. It'll take you to the link where you can download the book. If you get to their website and it says tweet this or Facebook this or whatever, you can ignore that if you don't want to do that. They want your email address, though, so they can send you the link so you can download the book. That'll subscribe you to their newsletter, and if you don't want to be on the newsletter, then you're going to have to unsubscribe, and I know it's a little bit irritating, but it's free, okay? So go ahead. It's a free book. If you're in a life group that's been reading this book, this week is chapter 4. Last week was chapter 3. And so if you're following along, that's kind of where we are. And my teaching today is coming in parallel to chapter 4 just a little bit. Not exactly from chapter 4. It's in parallel a little bit because what we're doing is we're trying to identify the 5 principles that help you identify your individual mission. But what I'm doing on Sundays is trying to take some of these principles and apply them to the specific relationships you have with your neighbors. And that comes out of this passage in Matthew chapter 22. Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus says the most important thing of all is that you would put God first, that you would love Him with your heart and soul and mind. But then the second thing is like it. And Jesus can't say the first important commandment without saying the second important commandment. He can't do the one without the other because they have to work together. In fact, the Apostle John would tell us that you can't love God unless you also love the people around you because God loves them. And so Jesus adds the second part. He says, the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And we were talking about how we have a tendency to make this into such a big command, such an umbrella command, that we're not practical with it. And I asked the question a couple weeks ago, what if Jesus actually meant love your neighbor? Love the people who are nearest you. Love the people who are closest to you. Love the people you actually have access to. Well, how do you do that? So we've talked for a couple weeks about what things your neighborhood needs and how you can love them. We learned that your neighborhood needs a mom. It doesn't need more discipline. It doesn't need more someone coming alongside and pointing fingers and telling them how they're wrong and how they need to follow the laws, because the Pharisees were doing that in Jesus' day. And Jesus said, no, I wish I could just be a mother to the people in Jerusalem. He had a motherly kind of attitude when it came to reaching out to them. And so we said, your neighborhood needs a mom. Well, then the next week is your neighborhood needs prayer, because as followers of Jesus, you're the only people who can offer a certain kind of thing to your neighbors, and that's your prayers. People who don't know Jesus don't have the same connection with God that you do, and so you can offer something to your neighborhood that no one else can, your prayers. And then last week we were looking at this idea that your neighbors need to be known. They need to have a relationship. They need to have someone who actually cares about them and their story. So today I'm going to give you another one of these profound statements that's so profound you probably have never thought of it before in your life. And it's the title of our message. It's simply this: your neighbors need to eat. Yeah, that's profound. They need to eat. Okay, so let me tell you something. We're going to be in a passage. We're going to look at a few food passages today. 3 food passages, in fact. 2 food passages that relate to today's message, and then 1 food passage that kind of takes us beyond it. But the first one is in Exodus chapter 24. You can go ahead and flip there if you're ready to get there. And while you go there, I'm going to tell you a little bit of my personal story about food. Some of my greatest relationships came out of food times. Some of my greatest relationships came out of eating together. When I was in college, the dining hall was called Saga, because Saga was the abbreviation of the previous company that had owned the food thing, the cafeteria thing, like 40 years earlier. And so when I was there, the company was long gone, but the name had stuck. And so there were a group of us that decided we wanted to be friends, and the way it got started was someone said, hey, why don't we go to Saga at 6 o'clock? And so it became a tradition for 4 years of college that the same group of people roughly would be meeting at the dining hall at 6 o'clock. It was just our standard thing. So you knew you didn't have to wait in line together. You didn't have to call people on the phone. You could just go to the dining hall, get in line, get your food, go out there. And if the table wasn't there with the people already sitting there, you just sit down, and within 3 or 4 minutes, the rest of them would show up. We tried to see how many people we could fit around the circle. You know, the tables were built for 8. I remember we once had like 20 around there, you know, just all packed in there because you're college students and everything's crazy. So we were doing this weird stuff, but the best time of all was when we invented a sport. Now, some of you have heard me talk about this sport with fondness in my eyes. My wife knows what I'm talking about. It's the world's greatest sport ever invented, and yet it's never made it onto ESPN. And in fact, I haven't played it since college because my wife has outlawed it. She's afraid people will die. She might be right. I don't know, but see, it's just an event unless it's dangerous. So here it is. It's called the apple game. And what you do is someone starts by getting an apple, a good apple, a nice, crisp, firm apple, not one of these mealy, mushy kinds of apples. It's got to be a good, firm apple. That person brings the apple to the table. Everybody else gets a fork. You hold the forks up. Okay? Then the person with the apple takes the apple and tosses it in the air to the other side of the table, whereupon one of the people on the other side of the table has to catch the apple on the fork, which sounds difficult, but it's actually not very hard because the weight of the apple is so much compared to the mass of the fork that it just kind of goes right onto the fork. It's very easy. It's a very easy thing to do, to catch that apple. It's really remarkable. You should try it sometime. You should bring an apple next Sunday with a whole bunch. I thought about going out there, but we don't have metal forks out there. We got these plastic ones. I thought about playing the game in here, but my wife would have said no. So she won't let me play it with the kids. I don't know why. Because, see, this is what happens next, and this is where it gets fun. The person with the fork and the apple now tosses the apple with fork across the table. Now, that's not a bad thing because, see, the apple weighs more than the fork. And so the apple leads the fork, it flies over, and the person on the other side of the table now catches that apple on their fork. It's perfect. The apple comes first, the fork is trailing behind. Now it turns into a sport because you've got a fork on the leading edge and a fork on the tailing edge, and when you flip that one in the air, the apple weighs more than both those forks, and no one knows what's going to happen next. That's when the fun comes. So then someone else has to reach up with their fork and time it just right as the forks are spinning, time it just right and catch it, and then toss it, and it continues on like that. One time we had like 14 forks in the same apple. They were all over the place. It was like throwing a spike ball at each other. It was awesome. And so the amazing thing is that at the end, when the last fork enters the apple explodes into shards of apple and forks go everywhere. It's awesome. It's one of the greatest sports ever invented. And it happened around the table at Saga. It came out of times of eating together. I can't even remember who invented it, but I want to claim that it was my idea because it was just that much fun. I miss those days. So here we're at a passage where we're going to see something about food, but I want to bring it up this way to just let you know, to remind you of this. Something happens when people get together to eat that does not happen when people just meet. Okay? Take a look at Exodus 24. Now, to set this up, if you flip to the left in the book of Exodus, you'll get to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is where God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And then these chapters following, Moses is on the mountain. He's getting all the laws that God is giving to him for the people, and he's jotting it all down, and the people are downstairs and all this stuff. When we get to chapter 24, something interesting happens. God wants to take the whole relationship with the country to a new level, and he wants to institute priests, and he wants to institute some elders for the community to be leaders. And so if you start at verse 1, I mean, we're really going to be paying attention to verse 9, but if you start at verse 1, the Lord says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron," Aaron is the high priest, "Nadab and Abihu," Aaron's two sons who will soon be priests, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You're to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him. So Moses can go near to the Lord. The other elders, the 70 elders plus the other 3 guys, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, his 2 sons, those 73 people are going to be near the Lord. So Moses is going all the way to him. The others are going to be near him, and all the people are at a distance. Okay? So God says that the 73 other guys, they can come up there and they can be near, sort of, but then Moses gets to go all the way. Okay? Now we go down to verse 9. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank. Now, elsewhere in the book of Exodus, Moses says, Lord, show me your glory. And God says, no one may see me and live. So what does it mean that they saw God? Well, in fact, the Hebrew word behind this word to see doesn't just refer to your eyesight. It refers to something bigger. It refers to a sense of understanding and knowing. In fact, another translation uses the word behold. And so it says that they beheld the God of Israel. They kind of saw him, they understood him. And so I'm not sure how you take that to mean, but other prophets have seen visions. Like Ezekiel, he saw a vision of God sitting on a throne. But Ezekiel tells us that he saw one who looked like the Son of Man sitting on a throne, high and exalted, distant. And he was surrounded by like a sea of sapphire or something. And then Isaiah saw another image. He had a vision where he saw one seated on a throne, high and exalted. And that's in Isaiah chapter 6. And so these other prophets had seen visions of God. But this doesn't tell us they saw a vision of God. This tells us they saw God somehow. Now, there's all kinds of ways you could maybe imagine what this is like or what they're actually seeing. But let me just be very clear with you. God had already told Moses, no one may see me and live. Other people have seen visions of one who looked like a son of man sitting on a throne. And in fact, what you find throughout the Bible is that when any time someone sees a human form that is worshiped as God, it's Jesus. Most likely what's going on here is they get onto that mountain and they see either on the mountain at a distance or somehow the curtain of reality is separated just enough so they can see into heaven. And what they see is Jesus somehow sitting on a throne. And there they see God, but they are not killed. They see God, but he doesn't lift his hand against them. And all that stuff is fascinating to me. I'm imagining it in my head. I'm wondering how awesome that would have been to be there and to be with God. But something amazing goes on immediately after they see him. Right after they see God, God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank. Now, God never told them to bring a picnic. He didn't say, Moses, bring them all up here and make sure they have food with them. So where'd the food come from? Okay, yeah, possibly they did bring it with them, and they ate and drank. But listen, these guys are going to meet God. Do you think they're saying in their minds, we're going to meet with God? Let's bring our food. Let's sit down. Let's hang out. Let's stay a while. Or do you think maybe God had provided something for them? The Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know exactly, but I'm leaning to believe that God had food waiting for them. He says, come on up. And they get there, and he says, eat. Eat with me. Food does something different. I went to a conference a while ago. My favorite story about any conference that I've ever been to is there's this conference called Impart, and a church out in Charlotte was one of the fastest growing churches. They started their church just about 6 months before we started our church, maybe about a year before we started our church. And so I was following this other church's events to try to figure out what they were doing and how they were doing it. And they just exploded with growth. Like in the first year, they grew to like 2,000 or 3,000 people. And then in just a couple years, they had like 6,000 people. They had 3 different campuses all over the place. And their pastor is a guy named Stephen Furtick, who's doing most of the Sunday morning teaching. The church is Elevation Church. And I was following it from a distance through podcasts and internet and stuff, trying to find out about what was going on. And eventually they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have a conference. We'll call it In Part. You guys show up, and what we'll do is we'll just give you everything we've done. We'll get a 1 gigabyte flash drive, and that was big in those days. We'll give you a 1 gigabyte flash drive. We'll put everything on that we've done, and you can just take it with you. You know, all of our documents, all of our policy statements, all of our structural statements, all of the things that we do. You can come, you can take that, and then we'll talk for a day about how we do what we do and why we're doing what we're doing. And I thought that would be cool. So I take a couple guys from the church here, and we drive out there, and that's a story in itself. And we get there eventually, and we're hanging out for this event, for this deal. And on the day, the pastor is telling us a story about another pastor who was preaching and had a guy in the audience who was just disruptive. And the guy in the audience kept yelling things out, you know, like, preach it, brother, or something like that. You know, is a kind of a call and response. He's saying, amen, or go. But instead of saying traditional church words like amen or preach it, he was saying this phrase, let the wild hog eat. No one knows what that means. But the kid, or this dude in that church, was yelling out, let the wild hog eat, whenever the preacher said something good, okay? I don't know why Stephen told us that story about the other preacher, but I took advantage of it. Because in the next message that Stephen gave us, he was telling us about how their church is focusing on quality rather than trying to be everything to every person. He said, this is our code as a church. We are Ruth's Chris, not Golden Corral. We are Ruth's Chris, not Golden Corral. So Golden Corral is a restaurant that's like a buffet. You go there and it's just got a whole bunch of food and you just grab what you want and then you go back and sit down. Ruth's Chris, on the other hand, they have one ingredient to all their dishes. It's beef. They have, you know, whatever you go there, you want to order something, you don't go to Ruth's Chris to order some frilly macaroni and cheese. You go to Ruth's Chris because you want a steak. You want a big, thick steak and you want it cooked awesome and all that stuff. You're going to pay $40 for that steak, but it's going to be awesome. So anyway, the guy was talking about how their church is focusing on quality, and he said something along the lines of, if you've never been to Ruth's Chris, you really should go. And then something happened there where he said something along the lines of, I wish I could send you all to Ruth's Chris so you could experience it. And at that moment, I yelled out, let the wild hog eat. And he said, I like that. Who said that? I'm sending you to Ruth's Chris. So he said that our whole team, my whole team, the 3 guys, you know, we could all go to Ruth's Chris, and on their tab, they were going to pay for it just because he thought that was awesome. So here's the deal. I'm going to a free dinner at an expensive restaurant, and I realize that this is a golden opportunity for me. So at the end of the day, I finally get a chance to meet Stephen face to face, shake his hand, and also to meet the guy who's sort of the brains behind the organization. So Stephen is the teaching pastor, and there's this executive pastor behind him named Chunks Corbett, and I got to meet him. He's a fascinating, tall, bald dude. So, you know, I just think that's awesome right there. He's the guy who helps the other guy. So, but you don't have to be bald to help people. So anyway, so Chunks, I got to meet him, and I thought, wouldn't it be awesome for me going out to dinner to be able to learn something in depth about the people who got this church started? And so I said to the guy who came up to me telling me about how to get our free dinner, I said, would it be possible for one of the staff members to come and join us and be with us? And he was like, I'll look into it. So he goes and he finds out that yes, and then we all go out to dinner, and the dude who shows up is like 5 steps down the totem pole, and he wasn't there from the beginning. He came in like a year or so afterwards, and it was cool and everything. He got to talk to us about his experience with the church, but it wasn't Stephen Furtick, and it wasn't Chunks Corbett, or any of the top leaders at the beginning. I met them, but I had no relationship with them, and so they didn't come to eat with me. They went home to eat with their family. See, I know they ate dinner that night, most likely. They went home to eat with their families. They didn't want to eat with me. It's not because they didn't need the food, and it's not because they didn't like Ruth's Chris. It's not because they didn't like the restaurant. It's because they didn't like me, sort of. They didn't have the time. They didn't want to invest that time. Now, I'm not blaming them for that. What I'm saying is that food means relationship. Food means relationship. In fact, write it down this way. The meal changes the encounter into a relationship. God brings the elders up to the mountain, and he does not just shake their hands, so to speak, and then say, thank you for coming, go away. He says, eat. And they eat and they drink with him. Food changes an encounter to a relationship. I want to take you to another passage here. In Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 1, we find a really fascinating story. This is a story about a guy named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. And a wee little man was he. I'm not doing the rest. So Zacchaeus is this guy, and he's one of my favorite stories in the Bible because I can relate to him being short, and I'm relatively short, and my dad is even shorter. I got him on that by an inch. So feel good about that. But Zacchaeus was always sort of a comrade of mine. I sort of felt an affinity towards him. So I want us to take us to this story because it's an interesting food story. Here it is. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Now you got to stop there. Because of course you need to remember what a chief tax collector means. First of all, he's a tax collector. And to review, to be a tax collector in the nation or in the Empire of Rome, what that meant was you had to bid the government of Rome with how much money you thought you could collect for them. And if they thought your bid was accurate and better than the other person's bid, they would accept you as the tax collector. So it wasn't like Rome said, I want this percentage of everybody. Rome just simply said, who wants to be a tax collector? And this person said, well, I'll raise $1 million for you. And this other person says, I'll raise $2 million for you. Who are they going to pick? They're going to pick the guy who says he can raise $2 million for him. And if he doesn't make that, something's going to happen to him. But if he does make it, he gets more promotions. Eventually, he makes it to chief tax collector. That's how they work. Now, I know you don't like the IRS people if they knock on your door and say, I want to do an audit, but at least you understand they're under a law that says, here's the law, and if they follow the law, then it all happens. At least, usually the IRS follows the law. You know, they're in a scandal right now with some situations. I don't really get into all that, but Zacchaeus was like the guy under scandal all the time. Because, see, this is how a tax collector makes his own money. He bids a certain amount to the Roman government, and the Roman government takes that certain amount from him. So how does he get money for himself? He has to take more than the government is supposed to get. And how does a tax collector become wealthy? By taking a lot more than the government is supposed to get, but acting like it's for the government. So the only way for a tax collector to live, to survive, is to deceive people. And the only way for him to become wealthy is to be really good at deceiving people. To tell them that, listen, the government needs this much from you, and then demanding it from them, even though he knows the government doesn't need that much. He's the one who bid that much, and now he's asking for even more. Everybody hated the tax collectors. And to top it all off, this guy was really good at his job, he was wealthy, and he was short. So when Jesus comes to town, it says this, Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. And of course, they weren't going to let him through. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, of course, Zacchaeus is resourceful. You know? He knows how to get things done. So he goes and he finds an alternate, a plan B. He goes, he finds the tree, he climbs the tree, he gets into the tree, and he wants to see Jesus from there. Now, this is where it gets cool for us. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now, when I was a kid, I tried this technique on a friend of mine. I said, Toby, I'd like to come over to your house today. And Toby said that would be fun. And then I went back to my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going to go over to Toby's house today. And my mom said, did he ask you? And I said, no. Did you ask him? Yes. You can't go. Why? Because my mom had a rule. You don't invite yourself over to other people's houses. You don't invite yourself over to other people's houses. That's imposing on them. And so I read this story, and when I was a kid, that was the thing that really bothered me more than anything. Zacchaeus is short, that's all cool. Jesus calls him down from the tree, that's kind of cool. Jesus invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house, whoa there. I mean, that's all kinds of trouble. What if Zacchaeus is serving strawberries and Jesus is allergic to strawberries? What if Zacchaeus' wife hasn't cleaned the house or Zacchaeus hasn't cleaned the house? What if their kid's there and they've got allergies and they're all sniffly, or they've got a cold and they're sick? Or what if they need to go to bed soon? Or what if Peter brings his wife with him and that's another mouth to feed? Or what if John brings his thunderous dad? Now we're all in trouble. So Jesus, just don't bother inviting yourself over to other people's houses. That's what I'm thinking, okay? And I look at this story and I'm so frustrated and so drawn to the fact that Jesus invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house, even forcefully. Jesus says, Zacchaeus, you need to get out of the tree now because I'm going to your house and you should be there when I get there. I must go to your house and have dinner. I'm going to have whether you're there or not, but I'm going to be at your house, so you should get out of the tree. Jesus is like, I'm just going to go over to your house. And for me, I think of all the hospitality concerns and worries when people go over to other people's houses. When we invite people over to our house, there are questions like, okay, what foods can you eat? What foods can't you eat? Do you like spicy stuff? Do you not like spicy stuff? Well, how spicy is not very spicy? And do your kids eat real human food, or do they live on hot dogs? And do you have children, and do we need to take care of the children? And so there are all these hospitality questions. But in Jesus' day, no one asks the hospitality questions. They're asking a different question altogether. Look at the next verse. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. They're not upset that Jesus invited himself over to Zacchaeus' house. It's not a hospitality problem. They're upset that Jesus would bother with Zacchaeus. That he would spend any time with Zacchaeus. Because they know better than we know. It's about relationship, not about hospitality concerns. He's going to be the guest of a sinner. Now, this is where the whole story takes a huge, amazing turn. In verse 8, they've had a meal. I don't know if it's in the middle of the meal. I don't know what Jesus has said to him, because between verse 6 and verse 8, we're outside listening to the people mutter. In verse 8, we get back inside and we miss what Jesus and Zacchaeus were talking about. But when we get inside, it says this, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, yes, you have, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, all of his wealth has come from tax collecting, right? Somehow, he's gotten wealth from tax collecting. So that means if he's cheated people, that means he's collected too much. He's going to pay it back 4 times the amount, but he's already given up half of his wealth to the poor people. So what's going to happen to Zacchaeus? Basically, what he's saying is I don't care. Every dollar I have, Lord, you can take and you can use it. Help me figure this out. Zacchaeus is like, my whole life is different. It's not about getting the dollars for me. It's about getting the dollars to those who need them or deserve them. His whole life is turned upside down. So here's what you should write down. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. That's right. I think it's the way to everybody's heart. When I first met my wife, I wasn't going to teach her the Apple game because I was afraid of what might happen. But I knew I wanted to spend some time with her. And I decided that since I was kind of nerdy, I would ask for her email address rather than her phone number. And she was kind of offended by that, as she told me later, but that's okay, because it worked out. So I got her email address, but I was still too nervous to ask her out on any kind of date or any kind of let's go somewhere. So instead, I decided it would be easier for me, rather than just asking her to go on a date with me, it would be easier if I convinced our entire college group to go to a movie together, and for everybody to bring some snacks, contraband style, to the movie. And lo and behold, I volunteered to bring some chocolate chip cookies, but oh, that's right, I'm not very good at making chocolate chip cookies. I need some help making some chocolate chip cookies. Jen, do you know how to make chocolate chip cookies? Could you maybe help me make some chocolate chip cookies? And so she came over to my apartment like 2 hours before the movie, which was Pocahontas, because I thought that was kind of girly. And so I coordinated this whole thing just to avoid going on the weird date question thing. So she comes over to my apartment. We start making some cookies. I pretend to be dumb. I've made them before. I know what I'm doing. But I pretended to be dumb and not know what to do with the cookies. And then somehow they ended up green. And we didn't use food coloring. It was just how they turned out, and they tasted fine-ish. But so anyway, we got through that. And then after that, a while later, she told me that she really liked pizza, and especially homemade pizza. And I was like, I didn't even know you could make pizza in home. Now, I knew you could. It's just we never did. My family never made homemade pizza. And so she said, well, let's make one. So I said, okay. So I went over to her apartment, and we made a homemade pizza, and it came out of the oven looking like a heart. And so I know some of you are like, oh, so lovey-dovey. They had a pizza, and it looked all pretty. It was like a heart. It's just so romantic. No, it looked like this kind of heart. That almost looks like a pizza, with the sauce and the cheese. You don't have to look at it. It looked disgusting, but we ate it, and we laughed, and it wasn't green. And the way to a person's heart often involves the stomach. And what happened to Zacchaeus changed his life. In verse 9, Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Jesus goes, and he's a guest of a sinner. And there in verse 10, he tells us why. Because he came to seek and to save the lost. That's his MO. He doesn't wait around for people to ask him in. He goes to them. He reaches out to them. He says, I'm coming to you. See, for him in his day, that wasn't breach of hospitality for him to invite himself over to Zacchaeus' house. It was a breach of etiquette for him to associate with a sinner like that. But he says, I don't care. I'm going to be where you live, in your world, in your environment, in your situation, and I'm going to love on you, and I'm going to build relationship with you. So why are we doing all this? It's because I want to encourage you to take the step, to take the risk of not just meeting or encountering your neighbors, but actually having meals with them, actually inviting them over. Actually, don't invite yourself over to their house, because that's a little weird in our culture, but invite them over to your place. And don't worry about all the hospitality concerns, just take care of it. In fact, I'm going to give you some tips, 7 quick steps, 7 quick ideas for how you can avoid some of the awkwardness. Number 1, you made a block map a couple weeks ago with names of your neighbors on some type of map. Go ahead and pray over that again. And especially while you're praying over it, say, God, would you draw my attention to 1 or 2 families that I can invite over? If you're uncomfortable making conversation for an hour and a half over dinner or something like that, then invite 2 families, because you got that extra buffer, more people to talk, and it works a little bit better. But if you're okay, just invite 1 family over. You get a little bit better conversation, getting to know them as individuals and as a couple. So invite 1 or 2 families over. Number 3, serve junk food. I'm telling you, because very few people are allergic to hamburgers. Some people choose not to eat hamburgers, and that's their problem. No, it's their decision. So you can address that. If people are vegetarian, then of course, make sure you got some veggie burgers or something. But junk food, I've never once seen a person reach into a bag of chips and say, man, I wish I could eat these, but I'm just so allergic. You know why? Because there's so little food content in junk food that no one can be allergic to it. Maybe some people have some issues, with the carbohydrates or something. But anyway, so here's the deal. I say serve junk food with a couple token health items of some sort, like, a plate full of vegetables, but make sure there's ranch dip. And the other reason is that everybody loves complaining about their eating habits. And it's easier to complain while you're choosing to eat that second bratwurst. So I'm saying that just because I think it's easy. But if you want to spend a couple hours in the kitchen making something really fancy, go ahead and do that too. But let's go ahead. Here's another tip. I'm encouraging you to skip the alcohol. If you have a neighbor who comes over to your house and they bring a bottle of wine and you're a family that enjoys a bottle of wine, then go ahead and do that because they've initiated it. They brought it over, okay? But if it's something that you're inviting them over, don't initiate it. Don't bring it up, because if they are a family that doesn't drink or for whatever reason doesn't like alcohol or something like that, then you can cross some lines and make them feel uncomfortable with that. So just skip it. You don't need to have that unless they somehow initiate it or something, and then do it with some cautiousness. But the next one is more important. Skip the religious stuff. I know you're inviting them over because the church told you to. You can say, hey, my pastor told me I'm supposed to invite you over to my house. Yeah, that's a great way to get them to show up. So I know you're inviting them over because you're trying to do this good neighbor thing. It's part of your church thing and all that stuff. Maybe they're following you on Twitter and they know why you're doing it, and that's a little bit weird or anything like that. But what I'm saying is skip the religious stuff. You don't invite people over to your house to have some type of religious ulterior motive. You just want to make some relationships with them, and God is going to take that wherever it needs to go eventually, sometime down the road. You don't need to have Christian rock music playing on your stereo when they come in. You don't need to have little Jesus fish napkin holders. You don't need to have the forks with the crosses embedded in gold on the handle of the fork. You don't need to have all these little hints and, oh, by the way, I'm a Jesus follower. You want to talk about him? It's okay. That conversation might come up and you might have religious conversations. You might have spiritual conversations as you get to know them, but you don't have to do that, try to coerce them. Here we go. Last ones. Ask and listen, and then finally make some notes after they leave. Because you actually want to get to know them. This is about relationship. This isn't just about an encounter. Okay. I believe that God is going to use this kind of experience in your life to help you get a better picture of what your mission is in your neighborhood. I believe out of the relationships, things are going to happen that change people's lives, including yours and mine. I believe it's going to be good because God is going to work in it. That's what it does. That's what relationships do. And I told you there would be 3 food passages we'd look at. And the third food passage we're going to look at today is about a relationship that is so deep and so personal that Jesus himself gave us a meal to do all the time. It's our communion meal. In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes about that event. He says this, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it, in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" 3 things happen in this communion meal. Number 1, we get connected relationally to Jesus and to each other. That's why it has become known as communion, because it is a community moment. It is a community experience. We get connected to Jesus and to each other. Number 2, we get reminded of the incredible thing he did for us. The incredible thing that he died on the cross that our sins could be forgiven. That he shed his blood that we could have a relationship with God, that he paid the price for all of our sin, that it could all be wiped away, washed away, and we could enter into a relationship with God free and clear. So it's a relationship with God that we can have because of what Jesus has done. And then thirdly, the third thing this communion meal reminds us of is that he's coming again. This meal is the appetizer for a feast to beat all feasts. And when he comes back again, there is going to be a party like nobody's business. It's going to be awesome. And this is just a taste. So, let me invite you. We're going to sing one song, and during that final song, we'll celebrate our communion time together. We'll pass our Connect card baskets after that. But let me let you know, whether you're a part of our church or not, whether this is your first time with us or not, we only have one requirement for people who want to join us in communion, and it's this. You can come forward and partake if by doing so you are saying, "Jesus is my all. I'm giving my heart and my soul to him once again, reaffirming once again that he is my King, he is my Lord. And so I'm coming to once again receive what he's done on the cross for me. If that's true for you, don't let anything hinder you. Come. Come forward, take a piece of the bread. We dip it in the grape juice, and then you can either eat it right there next to the table. You can kneel down if you want. You can go back to your seat. You can even go back to the back. Billy's going to be back there standing by the door. If you want someone to pray for you, he'll pray for you. But right now, let's take just a moment in quiet to reflect on what we've heard so far today and how God would be preparing our hearts for this symbolic meal we share with him. Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.